So let's take a little bit of time and talk about this important aspect of classroom management, creating an environment of respect and rapport. And really this consists of three key components: teacher-student relationships, mental set, and social-emotional strategies for teachers and students. So let's start with this first element, teacher-student relationships. The bottom line is that teacher-student relationships can have a tremendous impact on our students and their learning. And one of the most crucial findings in research is that having a positive relationship with students dramatically decreases off-task and/or disruptive behavior. Equally important is the impact that teacher-student relationships have on both student engagement and student achievement. According to the Danielson framework, creating an environment of respect and rapport is contingent upon classroom interactions between the teacher and students, and between students and other students that are respectful, reflect genuine warmth, caring, and sensitivity. We also want our students to exhibit respect for the teacher and to contribute to high levels of civility among all members of the class. The result is a classroom environment where all of our students feel valued and are comfortable taking intellectual risks. Key attributes of this type of environment include a teacher who demonstrates knowledge and caring about individual students' lives beyond the class and school, a lack of disrespectful behavior among students, students who respectfully correct one another when necessary, students who participate without fear of put-downs or ridicule from either the teacher or the students, and a teacher who respects and encourages students' efforts. Now, as aspiring teachers in practicums and in student teaching, we strive to attain at least a level 3 in the Danielson framework when it comes to creating an environment of respect and rapport. And at this level, teacher-student interactions are friendly and demonstrate general caring and respect. These interactions are appropriate to the ages, cultures, and developmental levels of our students. It also means that the interactions among our students are generally polite and respectful, and that students exhibit respect for the teacher. When we, as soon-to-be teachers, respond, we do so in a way that successfully mitigates disrespectful behavior among students. As a result, our classroom interactions are polite, respectful, businesslike, even though at times our students might be a little bit cautious about taking intellectual risks. And at a level 3, we can identify these critical attributes. The talk between the teacher and students and among students is uniformly respectful. We, acting as a teacher, successfully respond to disrespectful behavior among students. Our students participate willingly, but may be somewhat hesitant to offer their ideas. We succeed in making general connections with individual students, and our students exhibit respect for the teacher. It's important, however, to talk about what an effective teacher-student relationship is not. For example, effective teacher-student relationships really have nothing to do with how cool we are, that is, the teacher's personality, or whether or not the students view the teacher as a friend. Instead, what we want to seek to develop is the optimal teacher-student relationship. The optimal teacher-student relationship is more on the dominant side rather than submissive. By high dominance, we're really talking about being clear and providing strong guidance to students. This should be both academic and behavioral. In other words, we as a teacher provide a clear purpose and guidance relative to what the lesson will be, the content and the learning goals that are being addressed, as well as the behavior that's expected in the classroom. For example, let's take a look at this picture. Just by looking at it, can you determine who is in charge and what evidence do you see that that is the person that's in charge? Now, this is an example of what we call high dominance. This is actually a picture of a training activity between United States forces and those in Afghanistan. All of these individuals have a vested interest in the safety of operations, so there is this level of cooperation. But it's also clear who is in charge, what the objective is, and what acceptable comportment entails. That's what we mean by clarity of purpose and strong guidance. We provide to our students a clear purpose and guidance relative to what's being taught, as well as the behavior that's acceptable. I find it helpful to think of things in terms of metaphors and analogies. So for me, high dominance, it's kind of like a lifeguard at a pool. And why is that? Because at a pool, everybody has about the same objective, to enjoy the sun, to have fun, but it's also clear who is in charge and what acceptable behavior looks like. That's what we mean by high dominance. We also want to make sure that we've got the appropriate level of high cooperation. Now, high cooperation is characterized by a concern for the needs and opinions of others. It's also characterized by a desire to function as a member of a team as opposed to an individual. Think, for example, of a ward council, or how a ward council is supposed to run, where we have an individual who's clearly running the meeting, presiding, but listening carefully to the opinions and input of others in order to make a decision that will help everybody move forward towards their goals. In a classroom, that's what we're seeking to establish. High cooperation, in other words, concern for the needs and opinions of others, and a desire to function as a member of a team and not just based on what do I want as a teacher. So now if you could try and come up with your own analogy or metaphor. High cooperation, here's our definition, and think to yourself, it's kind of like because. Could you take about 30 seconds and come up with your own analogy or metaphor? You might come up with something like, high cooperation is kind of like being part of a sports team or part of an ensemble, because there's a concern for the needs and opinions of everyone, and we work together as a team rather than just seeking out our own individual desires. That is what we mean by high cooperation. What's really interesting is that when you look at research, teachers who first enter the profession tend to be highly cooperative. However, because they don't have a lot of experience in leadership positions, they tend not to be very dominant. And then over time, within about 6 to 10 years, these teachers become more competent at dominant behaviors, but they also unfortunately become less cooperative. In other words, teachers appear to decline in cooperative behavior and increase in oppositional behavior, and that's a change that negatively affects student attitudes. So here's an old photo of me when I first entered the profession. Research would suggest that I tended to be highly cooperative. In other words, I listened to and valued the input of others. But then, over time, in the first 6 to 10 years, where did I shift to? See if you can figure out where I would be in about 6 to 10 years based on what research indicates. You might have guessed that I'd end up somewhere around here. That means I'm becoming less cooperative, in other words, caring less about the needs of my students and valuing their input less. I would also become a little bit more dominant as I become more comfortable in a leadership role and establishing myself as the head of the classroom. And if I'm not careful, over time, I could end up even further from where I want to be, away from this optimal teacher-student relationship. I'd become more and more dominant, almost authoritarian, and not value at all being part of a team with my students or value their input, suggestions, and feedback. So the key is to not miss the mark, so to say, knowing that we'll probably start here, but we need to seek after this optimal level of dominance and cooperation. So in a nutshell, in other words, to sum up, we as teachers need to be effective instructors as well as teachers and lecturers, but we also need to be friendly, helpful, and congenial. We need to be able to empathize with our students, understand their world, and listen to them. But we also need to make sure that we're not uncertain, undecided, or confusing in the way that we communicate with our students. We cannot be grouchy, gloomy, dissatisfied, aggressive, sarcastic, or quick-tempered. In addition, teachers should be able to set standards and maintain control while still allowing their students responsibility and freedom to learn. So what does that mean for each of us? Well, it means that each of us need to ask ourselves this important question. Which of these attributes do I still need to develop? Let's spend some time talking about this, developing a mental set and responding to student behavior. Now, at the conclusion of this presentation, this icon will make a little bit more sense. But for now, what we need to understand is that when we work to identify and address off-task and or disruptive behavior in the classroom, we want to do so in a way that reflects warmth and caring, as well as results in a peaceful solution and helps to establish a relationship with our students. Now, there is no shortage of videos out there of teachers losing it on YouTube and on other sites. For example,
him and a meter from her, what are you doing? You know what, Eva? Eva, decide if you're going to be here. That's a stupid question. You know why I'm standing real close to you? Because I want to make a point and I want you to get it. Is it going to bother you? I'm spitting on you. Ew! Because I'm pissed. Good, go away. Now I don't have to stand by you.
Go take him. I'll keep on.
Now, as we prepare to become teachers in classrooms, we need to make sure that we develop a skill set that allows us to be and remain at our very best, even when addressing off-task and disruptive behavior. To do so requires us to develop this, a mental set. Now, if you look at this table, what we see is there's a tremendous impact that having a mental set has on off-task and or disruptive behavior. So we typically pay attention to effect sizes when it's 0.4 or above. This is actually 1.2, almost 1.3, more than 3 times the amount that catches our attention when we look at effect sizes. And we know that a mental set is composed of 2 components. It's composed of with itness as well as emotional objectivity. So when we talk about developing a mental set, what we're actually talking about is developing our with itness and our own emotional objectivity. So let's start here with the first component of a mental set, with itness. Simply put, with itness is the ability for each of us to remain alert and aware of what is going on in the classroom in order to identify possible disruptive behaviors and proactively address these behaviors. So let's take a look at an example. 2 boys are in the back of the class during a math lesson. One of them grabs the other's paper and the second one grabs his paper. Then the first one pokes the second in the shoulder jokingly and the other one pokes the first. Then they chase each other around the table laughing. Then one pulls the shirt off the other and the second pulls his shirt off. Then he unzips the second's fly and he unzips the first guy's fly and the teacher yells, "Boys, stop that!" Now you're asking yourself, surely my classroom wouldn't devolve to this point, would it? Well, this is what we understand. This all happens too late. It wasn't how the teacher said stop it or whether he or she walked closer or didn't walk closer. It wasn't whether he or she threatened or didn't threaten the students. It wasn't whether he or she demonstrated to the class that she knew what was going on, that she had eyes in the back of her head or anything like that. It was not whether she came in right away, but it was whether she came in before something spread or became more serious. This part, being aware of what's going on and dealing with it before it spreads and becomes more serious, is a key element of with itness. So what do we know about with itness? With itness is reliant on the detection of visual cues and events to make sense of what's happening in the classroom. We have to notice what's going on around us and interpret that information. We also know that with itness relies on cognitive competencies, thinking competencies that develop through our practice of continually monitoring the classroom. And then we have to interpret and understanding cues and events. That means that we can develop with itness through practice of monitoring our classroom. We also know that with itness is informed by a teacher's visual and perceptual abilities. Are they watching? Are they listening? Are they able to perceive what's going on around them? Simply put, and in my own words, with itness is circulating, listening, and most importantly, paying attention to the information that you're taking in. It might be helpful to think of teaching as a function of 2 different parts of our brain. The teaching side of our brain that worries about the lesson and the learning activities. The other part of our brain, however, needs to be constantly alert, listening to what's going on around us, watching to take in information, and reminding our body to move around, monitor, and address situations that are occurring. Now, we demonstrate with itness to students when we intervene promptly and accurately when inappropriate behavior threatens to become disruptive. Now, this minimizes any timing errors, and by that we mean when we fail to notice and intervene until an incident has already become extremely disruptive, as well as what we call target errors. These are mistakes when we identify the wrong student or the wrong element that's responsible for the problem. It's important to demonstrate with itness in order to minimize both these timing errors as well as these target errors. I sometimes jokingly call this the Santa Claus effect. I have 4 boys at home, and my youngest boy is on his best behavior from mid-November up until Christmas Day. And why is that? Well, he believes in Santa Claus. He believes that Santa is watching everything that he's doing. Now, this is what we find in various studies, that the act of observing affects the behavior of the people being observed. In other words, we act differently when we believe that we are being watched. That's why it's so important for us not to become anchored or stuck in one part of the classroom. Instead, we need to move and monitor much like a shark that's constantly on the move, tracking, noticing what's going on around us. In other words, with itness is a matter of creating a perception in our students that we, the teacher, are aware of everything that's happening in the class. You see these students at work, but in the back of their minds, they're thinking, oh yes, we're being watched, we're being noticed. Now, with itness is sometimes incorrectly thought of as something that people either have or they don't have, as an innate ability. But it's actually the opposite. We can actually learn to become with it by developing and engaging in very specific behaviors. For example, I'd like you to read the following lines. Take about 15 seconds to do so. Now, let me ask you this. How many F's were there in that passage? Can you remember? Take a guess. Now, what I'd like you to do is read it again in about 15 seconds, and this time be on the hunt for how many times does the letter F appear. Ready? Begin. Okay, how many times did the letter F appear? The correct answer is actually 9 times. Chances are you had a much closer guess than you originally had because you were on the hunt for something specific. Now, what do we learn from this? When we are with it, we are deliberately paying attention with our eyes, our ears, and moving and monitoring to be on the hunt for signs that students are off task and or disruptive, and to address those early on. Now, there are a number of activities and exercises from mindfulness, cognitive behavioral therapy, as well as other techniques that are designed to help us attune our senses. There is, of course, what we call mindful eating. If you'd like to take a look at that one, you can pause right here. There are also visual observation exercises that are designed to help us notice simple elements around us. If that catches your interest, you might pause here and take a look. There are also exercises designed to open our ears by paying more careful attention to music. By far, one of my favorite exercises is designed to help us train our ability to notice and monitor what's going on around us, even if we're engaged in something else. And it has 5 simple steps. First, we find a mild to moderately busy place. Think of a front porch, a commons area, a park, or a street corner. We make ourselves comfortable and begin a task that we typically do for fun. For example, reading a book, doodling, watching a show or movie, or playing a game on our phone. And we set a timer for 2 minutes. As we do this activity for fun, at the end of 2 minutes, we pause and come up with a list of everything that we see and hear in the space around us. Not immediately in the activity right in front of us that we're doing, our book, doodling, or watching a show, but what we notice in the world around us. Then we repeat that process several times for about 2 minutes each. What we find is that we can develop our ability to focus on one thing while also noticing with our eyes and ears other things going on around us. That is the first part of developing a mental set, is developing our with itness. To develop a mental set, the second thing we need to focus on is fostering our own emotional objectivity. Now you'll notice that this background changed to red to really draw attention to these key components. What we need to know is that we are emotional beings, and that means that we need to monitor our thoughts and our emotions. When we feel ourselves getting overly emotional, we need to reframe. In other words, think through how we're feeling, as well as the perspective of the student, to ensure that we're responding thoughtfully and not emotionally. Even when we are feeling a little bit upset or taking things personally, it's important for each of us to maintain a cool exterior. I like to call this the duck on the pond effect, where on the surface it looks like the duck is going very, very smoothly, but if you were to look underneath the water, it's just going 100 miles an hour, those little legs going as fast as they can. On the exterior, on the surface, we always need to maintain a cool, calm presence. Now this becomes easier to do if we're working hard to take care of ourselves, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and doing everything we can to prevent and recuperate from burnout. So let's start with this part, understanding a little bit more about our emotions. We need to understand that emotions are a normal part of being human. Some of our emotions are helpful, but some not so much. For example, our normal reaction, especially when it comes to student disobedience or a lack of response, is to feel hurt or even angry. Though we feel this way, we can't act with these emotions. And why is that? Because this is a high arousal emotional state that really doesn't provide a good basis on which we should implement rules or execute disciplinary actions, and definitely does not allow us to establish relationships. So one thing that we can and must do as teachers is to identify sources of stress and other emotional triggers that make it hard for us to maintain emotional objectivity. Now, these triggers can be personal events, certain times of the school year, maybe a specific student or faculty behavior that makes the teacher feel a certain way. For example, a teacher might become short-tempered toward the end of the semester because he perceives the student's inability to concentrate as some sign of disrespect rather than excitement. Another example might be this. A teacher might feel anxious because the in-laws are coming to town and allow this anxiety to affect his demeanor with the students. Now, once we identify the triggers that we have and why they make them feel the way we do, we have to try very hard not to let these feelings affect our interactions with students. So the teacher might also take extra steps to provide self-care, recognizing when he or she feels relaxed and in control, and act in a way that's more objective rather than subjective when around students. Each of us has triggers, so it's important to recognize those and then to ensure that these triggers do not impact our interaction with our students. Now, I'd like you to think for a moment about a time where you lost your cool, where you weren't your best, where you weren't at your best in a heated argument or discussion. And this is what we need to understand, is when we're upset or emotional, it actually changes the way that we think. Okay, what happens is instead of thinking with the front part of our brain, we devolve and our brain starts to release and we act upon stress hormones. Our prefrontal cortex actually begins to shut down, and instead our hippocampus hijacks everything that we do. Think of this as our mammalian or reptile or primitive brain making our decisions for us rather than us thinking through them. So what we can and should do is this: recognize, categorize, then actualize. In other words, recognize when we start to feel overly emotional. Then we begin to categorize or think through, well, I'm feeling a little bit of tension in my chest and arms and head. That means I'm probably reacting angrily to the student instead of thinking through things. We also might begin to categorize or think through the student's perspective, how he or she might feel and why that might be. As we start to categorize the way that we're feeling in our perspective, as well as think through the student's perspective, we start to turn our brains back on, the prefrontal cortex. And that allows us to actualize, or in other words, implement a plan rather than act in a way that's reactive and emotional. Recognize, categorize, actualize. Realize when we're emotionally heightened, categorize our feelings, our perspective, as well as that of the student, and instead of reacting emotionally, actualize or implement the plan that we've already established. So when it comes to developing a mental set, each of these components are crucial. With-itness, our ability to be aware of and to notice signs that students are off task and or disruptive and deal with those in a way that's prompt, early, and effective, as well as our ability to maintain emotional objectivity when we interact with students. We might think of addressing off-task and disruptive behavior in terms of this, using a blow dart rather than a hand grenade. When a hand grenade is used, everybody gets hurt. But when there's a blow dart, what we're doing is focusing on an individual issue or aspect of the classroom. I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to watch somebody hunt using a blow dart. They focus in on a single element, such as a bird or something else up in the trees. That is their focus that they target without disrupting the rest of the environment. That's what we mean by using a blow dart. It's called correcting fluently or responding to misbehavior in a way that does not disrupt other students or the flow of our instructional activities. It also means that we're responding in a way that doesn't harm the relationship we've established with the student or their motivation to do their very best in our classroom. We need to understand and embrace this reality that we will encounter a significant amount of off-task and or disruptive behavior. But we can reduce a significant amount of off-task and or disruptive behavior with 3 simple elements. These elements are establishing and teaching clear expectations, monitoring student behavior, and responding to student misbehavior in a way that's effective. Now, regardless of the approach that you take to classroom management, you'll find that each approach has two components: proactive elements as well as reactive elements. Proactive elements are the key components we do before off-task or disruptive behavior occurs. For example, teaching and modeling our expectations, moving around and monitoring during class activities. And then the reactive component would be something more like the way that we respond. So if you look at something like the Danielson framework, this is what's said. When it comes to expectations, it needs to be clear either from what we say or by what students can infer what the expectations for student conduct are. There's clarity between teachers and students about what is acceptable and what isn't. That's why it's so important to start off the school year or a class or an activity clearly communicating to students what our expectations are. We also need to monitor student behavior. Now, according to the Danielson framework, experienced teachers seem to have eyes in the backs of their heads. They are attuned to what's happening in the classroom and move subtly to help students when necessary. They also help students re-engage with the content that's being addressed in the lesson. When this is really done well, monitoring of student behavior is preventative and subtle and sometimes a little bit difficult to observe. So again, in the classroom, we wouldn't be anchored to one spot. We would be moving all around, addressing student needs, concerns, and noticing and addressing off-task or disruptive behavior. When it comes to responding to misbehavior, we need to understand this, that even experienced teachers find that our students occasionally violate one or another of their agreed upon standards of conduct. And the way that we respond is very important. Now, teachers who are more accomplished and experienced, they try to understand why students are conducting themselves in such a manner. They don't take offense to the way a student acts or reacts. They're trying to figure out, is my student unsure of the content? Are they trying to impress their friends? And then respond in a way that respects the dignity of that student. Overall, the best responses are always going to be those that address behavior early on, although it's not always possible to do so. So what does this look like in a classroom? Typically, when we notice students are off task and or disruptive, we use nonverbal cues. We might move our body a little closer to them, reduce the distance between us and them. We might also make eye contact, tap their desk. But if necessary, we can and should provide verbal reminders. Get closer to a group of students or a student and say, as a reminder, during our activity right now, we're supposed to be working on da-da-da-da. Let's make sure that happens. Thank you so much. And then take a few steps back and allow the student to make a better choice. Now, how can we tell if the way that we're addressing off-task or disruptive behavior is effective? If there is less of the undesirable behavior over time, or if it goes away completely, we have worked with the student in a way that is effective. Another way to tell if we're interacting with our students in a way that's effective is if there's an improvement in our relationships with our students. So right now we're going to spend some time thinking and talking about this, working with our students to develop self-monitoring and self-control strategies. And why does this matter? Well, according to CASEL, or the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, social emotional learning includes recognizing and managing our emotions, developing caring and concern for others, establishing positive relationships, making responsible decisions, and handling challenging situations constructively and ethically. So these are the skills that allow our students to calm themselves when angry, make friends, resolve conflicts respectfully, and to make ethical choices. In other words, our ability to function and navigate the difficult challenges of day-to-day life in school in ways that allow us to learn. Now, a resource that you have access through David O. McKay Library is the Handbook of Social and Emotional Learning Research and Practice. This compilation, representing the work of various authors, identifies 4 key benefits of incorporating social emotional learning into the classroom. The first is that it helps improve student achievement. The second, it increases students' empathy and kindness. Third, it improves students' attitudes towards academics. And fourth, it reduces depression and stress amongst learners. In addition, some current arguments being made in favor of incorporating social-emotional learning in schools include the notion that students who develop these skills being more likely to be successful in school and daily life. In addition, social-emotional confidence increases their likelihood to graduate from high school, go on to college, and have a career. Social-emotional competency also results in a greater chance of better mental health, more positive relationships, and a decrease in criminal behavior. Now, social emotional learning can take different forms in the classroom or throughout the school. For example, it could be when we incorporate texts and other learning activities that help foster a sense of self-awareness in our students. It could also be teaching students basic but essential relaxation and breathing techniques, such as these students here and here. It can take the form of developing class mottos and individual mantras that foster a growth mindset. Social emotional learning can also incorporate activities that help students better understand their emotions, their bodies, and helping them develop strategies for self-monitoring, self-regulating, so that they are better able to navigate through difficult emotions and situations. So now let's take a closer look at each of the 5 key skills of social emotional learning: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. First, we have self-awareness. And this can be defined as our ability to accurately recognize one's own emotions, thoughts, and values and how they influence our behavior. It also involves our ability to accurately assess our own strengths and limitations with a well-grounded sense of confidence, optimism, and a growth mindset. Elements of self-awareness might include identifying our emotions, accurate self-perception, recognizing strengths, self-confidence, and self-efficacy. In close connection to self-awareness, we have this element: self-management. Now, self-management is the ability to successfully regulate one's own emotions, thoughts, and behaviors in different situations. In other words, effectively managing stress, controlling impulses, and motivating oneself. This also involves our ability to set and work toward personal and academic goals. For example, impulse control, stress management, self-discipline, self-motivation, goal setting, and even organizational skills. A third and key component of social emotional learning is the skill of responsible decision-making. In other words, the ability to make constructive choices about personal behavior and social interactions based on ethical standards, safety concerns, and social norms. This also involves our ability to realistically evaluate the consequences of various actions, and to consider our own well-being and the well-being of others. This can take the form of our ability to identify problems, analyze situations, solve problems, evaluating, reflecting, and a sense of ethical responsibility. Equally important is this component, relationship skills, or our ability to establish and maintain healthy and rewarding relationships with diverse individuals and groups. It also involves our ability to communicate clearly, listen well, cooperate with others, resist inappropriate social pressure, negotiate conflict constructively, and to seek and offer help when needed. Relationship skills are manifest in our communication, our social engagement, relationship building, and teamwork. In close connection to relationship skills is this component, social awareness. Social awareness is the ability to take the perspective of and empathize with others, including those from diverse backgrounds and cultures. It also includes the ability to understand social and ethical norms for behavior and to recognize family, school, and community resources and supports. Key indicators of social awareness are perspective taking, empathy, appreciating diversity, and respect for others. So with all of these components, we might ask ourselves as teachers, where do we start? In other words, what is the role of a teacher when it comes to social emotional learning? One place to start is right in the curriculum. In other words, we seek to integrate social emotional learning into academic instruction. In other words, we weave deep academic learning experiences with opportunities for students to understand their own emotions, empathize with diverse perspectives, cultivate trusting relationships, solve problems constructively, and make decisions while considering the needs of others. So regardless of the age group or content area that I teach, I can find natural fits within the curriculum to foster academic mindsets, align my academic objectives with social emotional learning goals, seek to utilize an interactive pedagogy, work to elevate student voice, and seek to integrate social emotional learning into the supports that I provide to my students. As a teacher, I can also work at ensuring that discipline policies and practices are designed in ways that promote social emotional learning and equitable outcomes. So, as a social studies or history teacher, I might look at my curriculum and then look at the key components of social emotional learning and identify learning objectives, assignments, and learning activities that lend themselves and would benefit from explicit connections to skills in social awareness, relationship, responsible decision-making, or any of the other components. The key is for each of us as teachers to ask ourselves, where would my curriculum and social-emotional learning complement each other? Or in other words, where is there overlap between what is being taught and the key skills of social-emotional learning? But if we return to this question, what is the teacher's role? Social-emotional learning can take the form of a supportive classroom climate, or a learning environment where students feel emotionally safe, part of a community of learners, and where they feel motivated and challenged. Because after all, this type of environment creates a strong foundation for students to engage fully and to take academic risks. So the teacher's responsibility would include working strategically to foster a sense of community in the classroom, to provide students with a sense of belonging and emotional safety, and to interact and even redirect students in ways that foster relationships, encourage good decision-making, in other words, student-centered discipline. Teachers can also find opportunities to provide students with explicit social-emotional learning instruction. In other words, provide them with consistent opportunities to cultivate, practice, and reflect on social and emotional competencies in ways that are developmentally appropriate to their students and that are culturally responsive. So working in conjunction with other teachers and administrators, teachers should work to locate and incorporate evidence-based programs designed to support social-emotional learning in the classroom. So in summary, integrating social-emotional learning into our existing curriculum, providing a supportive classroom climate, and providing explicit social-emotional learning instruction are an essential part of our role as teachers in order to help our students experience success. But what is the school and the school district's role? Well, the school's responsibility is to work to align the school climate, programs, and all the practices in ways that promote social-emotional learning for students. At a school or building level, there should be work to foster a supportive school climate, work to ensure that an evidence-based program for social-emotional learning is adopted, to operate in ways that elevate student voice, to ensure that social-emotional learning is incorporated into student supports, and to ensure that discipline policies and practices are designed in ways that promote social-emotional learning and result in equitable outcomes. Schools also need to work to foster strong family partnerships. In other words, meaningful partnerships and two-way communication between the school and families. Schools also need to work to foster strong community partnerships to ensure that their students receive consistent social-emotional learning supports, that they have access to a broad range of community services, and to help teachers better understand the responsibility and opportunity to provide students with social-emotional learning experiences. Now, we might be tempted to say to ourselves, I don't have time to teach social-emotional learning in addition to all the other things that I'm responsible for teaching. Or, I just don't have the knowledge about social-emotional learning that I need in order to teach my students these skills effectively. However, as teachers, we know all too well what smarts without social-emotional learning skills look like in students. It can look like individuals who are obsessed with their own success and status but are indifferent to the plight of others. It can take the form of youth who are unable to sustain employment because they can't get along with their coworkers. It can also manifest itself in the many young people who resort to an array of self-destructive behaviors because they are unable to communicate their pain and grief and confusion to anyone else. In other words, without social-emotional skills, our students and their success will be incomplete. However, if we take the time to learn more about and to incorporate social-emotional learning into our classroom, we can help ensure that our students are completely competent and equipped to face the challenges they are likely to face. So let's take a look at some specific classroom examples of what social-emotional learning might look like. You remember that one of the elements of social-emotional learning is self-awareness, or the ability to recognize our own feelings, interests, strengths, and in addition, the ability to maintain an accurate level of self-efficacy. So we can tell that these students are equipped with self-awareness when they are capable of describing and understanding their own emotions, recognizing their own strengths and weaknesses, and that these beliefs about their own strengths and weaknesses actually influence the academic choices that they make, as well as how long they will persist on tasks, and to what degree they seek out assistance on academic tasks. What could this look like in the classroom? Let's take a look at this example, fostering self-awareness and empathy with grounding texts. Here's an idea from Edutopia, the link to which can be found in the comments section of this video. And here we have several ideas for how teachers might use literature as a gateway to explore sensitive themes like race, bullying, and personal values. You can see at the heart of this approach is well-being. So students in 7th grade are working to develop an understanding of their self, others, relationships, with the help of a facilitator in the school called a well-being coach. Older students are being taught in groups of 12 for 4 50-minute coaching sessions each week. And the idea is that each of these groups of students explore topics like bullying, identity, race, all through grounding texts or works of literature like Wonder, Refugee Boy, and even picture books like Sailing Boats in the Sky. Now, this is accomplished through coaching, but remember, these aren't additional staff members. Every teacher is considered a coach. These coaches work to establish and maintain meaningful relationships with their students, trying to be aware of, knowledgeable about, and mindful of the whole child. In other words, understanding his or her background, their home life, needs, and goals. And within the curriculum, well-being is implemented. Teachers work together to develop and implement curriculum maps. In this case, this is grades 7 through 10. They work with students to identify strengths and aspirations, using activities centered around these questions. Also to examine and improve kindness, self-control, optimism, and learning. Other key ingredients include a focus on purpose, humor, mindfulness, and giving. Then different texts are used as a backdrop to discuss difficult topics. For example, in the last chapter of the book Wonder, a character named Mr. Tushman gives an impressive speech. This teacher uses the chapter to explore greatness by asking students, what is greatness? Noticing that students who speak to her one-on-one about dealing with anxiety and stress aren't really able to define greatness. In another grade, a teacher works with students to read through a book called The Exam by Andy Hamilton. It's basically a comedy about exams and tests, which tend to get all of us into stress and anxiety. So what the teacher does is try to match where he or she thinks the students are at with that topic and text in order to help each one explore the issues that are most relevant and pertinent to them. In summary, this idea of fostering self-awareness and empathy using grounding texts consists of teachers working together to identify books and other resources that help spur student discussion about sensitive themes, either in a group format or one-on-one with the teacher. So let's look at another example of social-emotional learning instruction. This one in self-management skills. Now remember that self-management skills allow our students to handle daily stresses and to control their emotions under difficult situations. Our students' capacities to regulate their emotions impact their memory, their cognitive resources. In addition, self-management skills include their ability to monitor and reflect on personal and academic goal setting. Academic goal setting, in turn, has important implications for our students' motivation, as well as the learning strategies that they use to master material. So how could we introduce and help students develop these types of skills? In the comments section of this video, you'll find a link to this, which was produced by National Public Radio, a short story titled Self-Control for a Monster. In this video, Cookie Monster works to develop his own set of skills to keep his hands off of the sweets. It was designed to help teachers work with students to develop new strategies to resist temptation and to reach their own goals. In this video, Cookie Monster models behaviors such as taking a deep belly breath, looking in a different direction, reflecting and focusing on the reason why we are waiting. He also uses strategies to distract himself and to shift attention towards something else. This comical video and the discussion that we could have with students afterwards is one way to help our students develop self-management skills. We can also provide explicit instruction in social awareness. By social awareness, we're talking about our students' capacity to take others' perspectives into account and to empathize with others. When students are socially aware, they're more likely to recognize and appreciate similarities and differences of other students. This social awareness is particularly important for students as they participate in new instructional shifts. This is because students need to take the perspectives of their classmates during classroom discussions and attempt to empathize and relate with characters during analysis of texts. So let's see an example of a lesson that focuses on social awareness. A link to this resource can also be found in the comments section of this video. In it, we see 4 proven strategies for teaching empathy. The first of which is modeling. Teachers can be role models who by example show students the power of demonstrating empathy in perspective and relationships. As teachers model how to be positive when learning, students tend to mirror optimistic and confident learning behaviors. Teachers can also work to teach point of view. For example, this teacher reports using the numbers 6 and 9 to teach students about different points of view. First, have students look at the number 6 and then the number 9. Explain to students that the idea for the exercise came from an old Middle Eastern legend in which 2 princes were at war for many years. One prince looked at the image on the table and said it was a 6, while the other prince said it was a 9. For years the battle raged, and then one day when the princes were seated at the table, a young boy turned the tablecloth around, and for the first time they could see each other's point of view. Then the teacher works to illustrate with examples from their own life in which something similar had happened to them. In other words, arguing with somebody just because they had a different point of view. Then students are asked to break up into small groups and discuss how important it is to understand that many people disagree simply because they have a different point of view. Afterwards, teachers and students work to debrief the student comments. Literature can also be used to teach different perspectives. For example, in the story of the Three Little Pigs, we tend to sympathize with the pigs and see the wolf as the villain. However, a different perspective is shared, the wolf's point of view, in John Sieska's undertaking of the story in The True Story of the Three Little Pigs. Other activities for developing empathy in our students involve listening actively to others. In other words, teaching specific strategies such as HEAR, an acronym for HALT, ENGAGE, ANTICIPATE, and REPLAY. By modeling and asking students to practice actively listening to others, each of these lessons focus on developing social awareness, or learning to take others' perspectives into account when empathizing with others. Another important social-emotional learning skill is relationship management, which allows students to develop and maintain healthy relationships with others, including the ability to resist negative social pressures, to resolve interpersonal conflict, and to seek help when needed. After all, our students need to be able to work well with their classmates in order to participate in collaborative groups. Now, what could this look like in the classroom? A link to this resource has also been provided in the comments section of this video. Notice that specific strategies are provided to help students communicate clearly, listen well, cooperate with others, and resist inappropriate social pressure. There are also ideas for helping students negotiate conflict constructively, as well as seeking and offering help when needed. Some of these strategies include class meetings and shared norms, the development of class contracts, as well as structured student-based activities, where students are allowed to work with different partners throughout the class time. These and other strategies focus on relationship management, or our students' ability to develop and maintain healthy relationships and interaction with others. Finally, teachers can work with students to develop responsible decision-making, which enables our students to keep in mind multiple factors such as ethics, standards, respect, and safety concerns when they make their own decisions. This matters because it involves our students' capacity to identify problems and develop appropriate solutions to those problems, whether the challenges be social or academic. For example, researcher Robert Marzano suggests helping students implement student self-assessment. In student self-assessment, the teacher periodically asks students to assess their own level of adherence to classroom rules and procedures. To do this, the teacher simply presents students with rules and procedures and asks them to rate their adherence to those rules and procedures on a scale of 0, which indicates not adhering, to 4, or exemplary adherence. The teacher might choose to have students assess their own behavior relative to general classroom rules or the rules and procedures for a specific activity, for example, working in groups. The idea is that students should be given the opportunity to self-assess on a fairly regular basis so that they can see their own progress. In another of his works, Classroom Management That Works, Robert Marzano says that students should be given the message that they are responsible for their own behavior and that they should be provided with strategies and training to realize that control. One action step he suggests is to employ general classroom procedures that enhance student responsibility. For example, the classroom meeting, asking students to use a language of responsibility, allowing them to write out statements of their own beliefs, as well as written self-analysis. A second action step is to provide students with self-monitoring and self-control strategies. These can be designed for students for whom the general plan isn't working. These strategies can also communicate intent of helping the student to succeed and describe the process of what self-monitoring and self-control look like and feel like. A third suggestion is for teachers to provide students with cognitively based strategies. Marzano says this will help improve social skills and problem solving. It's important to keep in mind that social-emotional learning can take place in a variety of formats and contexts. Regardless of the approach that we choose to use with our students, it should be focused on one or more of these key skills of social-emotional learning: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and/or responsible decision-making. So there you have it. Creating an environment of respect and rapport consists of three key areas: teacher-student relationships, mental set, and social-emotional strategies for teachers and for students.